Finally, the house was all mine. My parents had left for a business trip and entrusted me with the house for an entire week. The weather was perfect for a celebration, and I was excited. I had wanted to throw a party for some time, but always felt something was missing. Now was my chance to do everything my way. I spent the entire afternoon cleaning and decorating. The main room was transformed with twinkling lights and balloons. The aroma of cake and chips filled the house, blending with the loud music I had put on to set the mood. Every detail was carefully considered. I wanted this to be an unforgettable night. My parents had always said I needed more friends, and this was the perfect opportunity to make new ones and finally fit in with the crowd. However, my enthusiasm was slightly overshadowed by anxiety. The idea of having a group of classmates at my house made me a bit nervous, but excitement outweighed the worry. I had planned everything to ensure the night would be a success. A group of popular kids from my class seemed like exactly what I needed to stand out. With a smile on my face, I sent out the invitations via the school messaging group. My heart raced as I saw the positive responses start to come in. This is going to be amazing, I thought, imagining how the night would unfold with laughter and fun. They were all confirming their attendance, and the anticipation was high. As the sun set and night approached, the house grew busier. The music was loud, laughter echoed, and I was finally feeling like I belonged with this group. But amidst the euphoria, an unsettling feeling began to bother me. There was something in the looks and conversations that made me uneasy, a strange sense that not everything was as it should be. Despite this, I continued with forced enthusiasm, trying to ignore the growing sense that something was out of place. I was so focused on making sure everyone had a good time and that the party was a success that I began to disregard the small, strange vibrations I felt, as if the house itself was filled with palpable tension. The guests' joy didn't match the unease I felt, and I began to wonder if there was something I was missing. The night was progressing, and I was starting to feel more comfortable with my classmates. The music was playing, and everyone seemed to be having a good time. However, something about the atmosphere felt slightly off, as if a strange energy was hanging in the air. I tried to ignore it, focusing on making sure everyone was comfortable and well served. That's when I noticed a group of classmates retreating to a darker corner of the room, whispering among themselves with a mischievous glint in their eyes. At first, I thought they were just planning some kind of friendly prank or surprise for me. However, as the group moved silently, my unease began to grow. A little later, one of the guys, Mark, approached me with a strange smile. "Hey, did you know that what you've done is attracting something?" he asked, his tone sounding more serious than it should have. I laughed nervously, trying to dismiss the macabre tone of his voice. "What do you mean?" Mark just shook his head and walked away, leaving me with a strange feeling. When I started watching the group more closely, I noticed they were carrying items that weren't part of the original decorations, extra speakers, flashlights, and objects that looked like they were straight out of a horror movie. They were moving with a quiet efficiency, and my anxiety grew. Gradually, I began to understand what was happening. They were setting up a scenario to scare me. The idea of a prank started to solidify in my mind. It seemed like they had planned everything down to the smallest detail, disturbing sound effects, mysterious objects hidden around the house, and horror stories starting to circulate among the guests. At first, it was hard to believe. But the pieces were falling into place, and concern was turning into palpable fear. As the party reached its climax, the classmates began to execute their plan. Lights flashed intermittently, and strange sounds echoed through the halls. I tried to stay calm, believing it was just an innocent joke. But as the events unfolded, the fear I had been trying to ignore started to intensify. Voices whispered, and the lights flickered in a way that seemed much more sinister than any special effect could justify. Horror stories began to spread among the guests, and I realized this wasn't just a light-hearted prank. They were actually trying to scare me. I felt like a puppet in a cruel game, where the line between fiction and reality was starting to blur. Shadows moved irregularly, and objects seemed out of place. A chill ran down my spine, and what should have been a fun night was quickly turning into a nightmare. As I tried to cope with the growing panic, the classmates continued their performance, escalating the prank with every step. I felt the house becoming increasingly oppressive, as if an invisible presence was growing more and more real. What started as an animated party was turning into a night of terror, and I was trapped at the center of this cruel illusion. At first, the strange events were subtle, almost imperceptible. It was as if something was lurking in the shadows, just out of sight. The lights flickered occasionally, and I thought it was just a technical issue. But when the music started to fail and the volume became irregular, I began to feel a growing discomfort. That's when I noticed something truly unsettling. While talking to a friend, one of the back doors slammed shut. At first, I thought someone had closed it by accident, but when I went to check, I found the door locked. The key was in a drawer where I knew it hadn't been left. My heart raced, and a chill ran down my spine. Trying to ignore these small anomalies, I decided to focus on the party. That's when the classmates started telling horror stories. Mark, the same guy who had mentioned attracting something, was the center of attention. He began telling a story about a haunted house, an ancient curse, and an entity that fed on the fear of the living. The story seemed to fit perfectly with the eerie atmosphere they had created. As he spoke, the environment around us seemed to come alive. The whispers I had heard earlier became clearer and more menacing. "They come when you least expect it," Mark said, with a look that seemed more genuine than theatrical. Guests began to grow uneasy, and I saw nervous glances being exchanged. Some tried to distract themselves with the music, but the distant sounds that began to creep in, like thuds and dragging footsteps, only heightened the fear. Screams and nervous laughter became more frequent, and the festive mood quickly dissipated. Fear spread throughout the room. Some guests began to comment on seeing strange figures in the shadows, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. What had started as a prank seemed to be taking on a darker, more real form. Objects in the house seemed to move on their own, and small, inexplicable incidents began to occur more frequently. A candle that had been lit suddenly went out with a cold draft, and a chair fell over by itself. The horror stories started to feel less like fiction and more like a sinister warning. The atmosphere at the party became oppressive, and what should have been a night of fun was rapidly turning into a nightmare. Conversations dwindled, and panic began to take hold of the guests. I myself could no longer distinguish between reality and fantasy. The house seemed alive with a malevolent presence, and the sense of terror grew with every passing minute. I tried to stay calm, attempting to rationalize what was happening. But as the fear intensified and the events became more disturbing, I realized that something far more sinister was at play. The environment was charged with a sense of impending disaster, and the party was about to become something much more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The situation was rapidly deteriorating. What had once seemed like a series of uncomfortable pranks was now transforming into a real nightmare. The lights flickered incessantly, and the crashes coming from upstairs grew increasingly intense, as if something heavy was moving around up there. The air in the house was thick and cold, and the environment seemed to be disintegrating around us. A group of classmates, including Mark and some of the apparent architects of the prank, were trying to maintain their composure, but there was no ignoring the growing chaos. One of the girls, Emily, let out a piercing scream when a dark figure flashed past the window. When we looked outside, there was nothing there, but the fear had already taken hold completely. Then things started to unravel horrifically. The sound of sadistic laughter and unintelligible murmurs began to fill the air. It felt like the house itself was laughing with us, its walls echoing with sounds I couldn't identify. One of the doors opened by itself, revealing a darkness so dense it seemed to swallow the light. Mark, in a state of panic, tried to explain what was happening. He seemed to be struggling to find words that made sense. I think this isn't part of the prank, he said, his voice trembling. I think we've brought something real. At first, I thought it was just another attempt at creating panic. But then I saw something that made me believe his words. A mirror in the hallway began to show distorted images, as if reflecting something that wasn't there. Instead of our faces, we saw a nebulous, dark entity, a presence that seemed to writhe and change every second. That thing seemed to be approaching us, even through the glass. We tried to rationalize, looking for logical explanations for the events. But our attempts to calm the situation failed miserably. Emily tried to use a protection ritual she found online, but when she did, the lights began to flicker violently and an invisible force knocked her to the ground. The radio, which had been static, suddenly began to play a distorted voice, murmuring words in an ancient language. Desperate, we tried to leave the house, but the front door was locked and unresponsive to our attempts to open it. Panic took over the group, and attempts to communicate with the outside world were futile. Our cell phones had no signal, and any attempt to call the police only resulted in a buzzing interference. The sense of despair and helplessness was overwhelming. We tried to light candles and place protective objects around the house, but the entity seemed to be growing stronger, disregarding any attempts to calm the situation. I could feel the presence of the thing increasing, as if it were watching us and feeding off our fear. At that moment, it was clear that we were dealing with something far more dangerous than any of us could have imagined. What had started as a simple prank had turned into an absolute nightmare. The entity seemed to be feeding off our energy and the terror that had settled in the house. The house was becoming a maze of terror, and we were trapped, unable to escape the malevolent force we had unwittingly unleashed. Attempts to appease the situation failed, and the only thing left was the fear that the entity had no intention of letting us leave alive. Chaos ensued with the arrival of the entity. The entire house seemed to come alive, trembling and contorting as if in agony. The walls pulsed and the furniture moved on its own, as if an invisible force was destroying everything in its path. The sound of screams and the crash of destruction mingled with a cacophony of distorted laughter and sinister whispers that seemed to come from all directions. I was paralyzed with fear, watching the environment crumble around me. Mark was trying to communicate with someone outside the house, but his words were drowned out by the deafening noise of the destruction. The other guests were equally terrified, running back and forth, trying to find an exit that seemed increasingly distant. A dark shadow formed and stretched across the walls, swallowing anything that came into its path. Emily, with tears in her eyes, tried to open a window, but the entity's force seemed to prevent any attempt at escape. I saw her being pushed back by an invisible force, and the window slammed shut with a terrifying bang. The guests were screaming, their faces contorted in expressions of pure panic, while the entity seemed to revel in our despair. The terror intensified when I realized that the entity was not only moving through the house but also hunting us. The shadows stretched and moved as if they had a life of their own, attacking anyone who tried to escape. The hallway became an endless maze of darkness and destruction, and each step seemed to lead me deeper into the nightmare. We tried to regroup, but the entity seemed to anticipate all our movements. Doors closed and locked on their own, and the floor became increasingly unstable, as if the house itself was trying to imprison us. The agonized cries of my friends mixed with the diabolical whispers that filled the air. Every attempt to find an exit seemed only to deepen our entrapment. In those final moments, I was completely terrified and exhausted, my screams blending with the sound of chaos around me. The entity, now visible as a pulsating mass of darkness, seemed to take pleasure in our despair, its oppressive and overwhelming presence. Amidst the chaos, I realized there was no escape. The entity had surrounded us, and the sense of defeat was palpable. The story ends with an intense scene of horror. The last thing I remember is the entity approaching slowly, its empty, deep eyes reflecting the fear I felt. The shadows closed in on me, and the world around me disintegrated into a whirlwind of darkness and screams. What happened next remains a terrifying mystery. The house was found in ruins the next day, but none of the guests were found. What remains is an unanswered question. Was the entity satisfied with the terror it caused, or does it continue to lurk, waiting for its next victim? Whatever happened, the story remains a dark and frightening legend, haunting those who dared to hear about the night the malevolent entity was unleashed.